Good afternoon, everybody. I am Professor Dimitrios Diamantaras from the Department of Economics at Temple University, and I'm also the academic advisor of Theta of PA, which is the chapter of the International Honor Society Omicron Delta Epsilon for Temple University. Today, we are having our fourth annual Nobel lecture in economics. We started this 4 years ago at the excuse me, prompting of Professor Michael Leeds, who actually will be today's speaker. The lecture talks about the latest economics Nobel Prize, and it is co-sponsored by not only Theta of PA, but also Phi Beta Kappa and the Tempo Economic Society. Reminder, I see the chat is livening up already. If you are a student who is expecting extra credit for a class, please put in the chat your name, class number and name, and professor name. And we're taking care of preserving that information so you can actually then receive the extra credit. Also, if you are a Fox student, there will be a QR code displayed at the end during or near the end of the Q&A session. So hold on to that and you will be able to then scan it and receive the credit you expect from that. Let's see. I will repeat the reminders about the chat and the QR code right before the lecture starts, but we need to keep going. So I now give you Assistant Dean Chris Wolfgang, who is going to talk about Phi Beta Kappa briefly.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for letting me join you today. Can you see my screen? Okay, great. So my name is Chris Wolfgang. I'm Assistant Dean for Student Services in the College of Liberal Arts. I also serve and have served for many years as Secretary and Membership Chair for the Road Chapter of Pennsylvania of Phi Beta Kappa. I'm just here today, and it's great to see so many folks participating in this wonderful event. And just here today to put in a little bit of a plug for Phi Beta Kappa. I'm imagining at a Nobel lecture in economics on a Friday afternoon that many of you attending are distinguished students and scholars yourselves, and may find yourselves receiving an invitation from us in the spring. So I just wanted to share with you, and if you are earlier in your studies, wanted to share with you just a little information about our membership requirements. So for Phi Beta Kappa, which is one of basically the world's foremost honor society in the liberal arts and sciences, we have very hefty GPA requirements, as you can see. We induct a smaller number of students every year as juniors, and those students require a 3.9 GPA, also college level mathematics proficiency, and at least intermediate language proficiency in a language. So those are a bit of our requirements. We're also looking for students who've taken sort of a broad-based, rigorous curriculum in the arts and sciences. And we review every eligible candidate each spring, and membership is by invitation only. But if you have any questions about Phi Beta Kappa, please feel free to reach out to me at my email address, which is just chris.wolfgang@temple.edu. And I would be happy to take a look at your records, give you any advice regarding eligibility, and answer any questions you have about the work that we do. And during the lecture, we will put some things in the chat that can serve as references to help you learn more about the Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society. But I appreciate your time, and I'm looking forward to this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Wolfgang. Now I'm happy to introduce Hazel Potalski, who is the president for this year of Theta of PA. And while she will be talking a little bit about the organization, and I will share briefly an informational slide. So Hazel, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Diamantaris. Yes, as he said, my name is Hazel Paholsky, and I'm president of the Theta PA chapter of Omicron Delta Epsilon this year. So I'm going to briefly go over why you should consider joining and the benefits of membership. So there's international recognition of scholastic achievement, as Omicron Delta Epsilon is an international honors fraternity. And with that, it looks great on a resume for internships and job applications and grad school as well. If you are an undergraduate interested in membership, you'd have to have a strong interest in economics, completion of 12 hours of economics courses at the time of your application, and a cumulative GPA of 3.0, as well as a GPA of at least 3.0 in economics coursework. And if you're a graduate student considering membership, you would have to have completion of 1 semester of full-time coursework, as well as a major or minor in economics and a GPA of 3.0. We will be recruiting for new members in the spring, but if you have any questions now or next semester, you can contact Dr. Diamantaris or me at our emails, which are shown on the screen. Yeah, that's about it. So now I will introduce Ben Ginsberg, who is the president of the Temple Economic Society, and he can tell you a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Hazel. Appreciate it. My name is Ben. I'm the president of Temple Economic Society. For some reason, my share screen isn't working right now. So I'm just going to talk about TES a little bit. TES is the primary community for Temple economics students. You don't have to be an economics major to join. You just have to be interested in econ and be a student at Temple. We meet every week in Alter Hall room 239 from 12 to 12:50 p.m. Where we host great economics speakers, fun debates, and job and internship workshops. We also host a variety of special opportunities, including volunteer opportunities, social events, trips, including our annual trip to Washington, D.C. for the NABE policy conference. We also host like exclusive networking and career fairs. So the club's a great time. Feel free to reach out to me at benjamin.ginsberg@temple.edu or to TES at econclub.temple.edu to learn more about the club and join. We're a great time, and it's a really fun community for economics majors. So on behalf of TES, thanks Dr. D for setting this event up. Thanks Dr. Leeds for agreeing to speak here, and really appreciate it.
I want to thank you all three for doing your little bit of presenting your organizations and doing it in a timely manner. And now, before Hazel will introduce the speaker, I want to ask the officers of OD to occasionally put my email and Hazel's email in the chat for people who might have questions about OD. And now, Hazel, there you go, introduce our speaker.
Yes, this year, Dr. Michael Leitz is going to be giving us our Nobel Prize lecture, and I know we're all very excited to hear what he has to say. If you don't know, Dr. Leitz is a professor of economics here at Temple. He teaches Intro to Econometrics, which I'm taking right now, as well as intermediate microeconomics, economics of sports, principles of macroeconomics, and socioeconomic context of business. So I'm sure that he's great in all of those classes. And I'm very excited to see what he has to tell us today about these wonderful Nobel winners. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Dr. Leeds.
I'm sorry to jump in and interrupt, but I forgot to mention that questions will happen after the presentation, after the lecture, and those will happen via the chat. Okay, so now I will be quiet and let Professor Leeds do his marvelous presentation.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, especially as for the first time I actually know one of the winners. That David Card was a year behind me in graduate school, and I can attest that he is a certainly a deserving winner of the Nobel Prize. But here we have pictures of them from left to right. Joshua Angrist on the lower left, and David Card in the upper middle, and Guido Imbens on the lower right. We'll talk about each of them in turn, talk a little bit about what it takes to win a Nobel Prize, and then get into a little bit about the contributions of the three of them. So Josh Angrist got his BA from Oberlin College out in Ohio. And then somewhat surprisingly to me, I found out just since he won the Nobel Prize, that after graduating, he joined the Israeli Defense Forces and was a paratrooper for the IDF from 1982 to 85. Came back to the US and got his PhD from Princeton University, where he studied with Orley Ashenfelter. That will be worth noting throughout this talk. And he is now the Ford Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. David Card was born in Guelph, Ontario. He actually grew up on a dairy farm. I've forgotten about that. He got his BA from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. He got his PhD also from Princeton University, where he also studied with Orley Ashenfelter. So if you want to get a Nobel Prize in economics, there's a clear path for you. And I am not making this up. That's not a made-up name. There is a picture of Orley Ashenfelter, who was a professor of mine. So David Card went on to win the John Bates Clark Medal, which is given to the top American economist under the age of 40, and is now class of 1950 professor of economics at UC Berkeley. Guido Imbens is from the Netherlands. He got the equivalent of a BA from Erasmus University in Rotterdam, got his PhD from Brown, and I don't know how he did manage to win a Nobel Prize, but he did not study with Orley Ashenfelter. And he now actually has 3 posts where he's professor of economics at Stanford Graduate School of Business, is a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and is a professor of economics at the Institute's School for Humanities and Sciences. So again, there are a lot of really, really good economists. I mean, being a really good economist, they're a dime a dozen. So what is it that distinguishes a great economist from a really, really good one? Well, the really good economists contribute to the conversation. They add something to what we're talking about. They bring something interesting to the table and advance what's being discussed. The great economists just change what's being talked about. And I can tell you from experience that Angrist, Card, and Imbens changed the conversation. That applied econometrics is simply different because of them, that they have literally changed the field. And I know this because I had to completely relearn econometrics about 10 years ago when the sea change in econometrics became evident. the common thread to what they have contributed is the idea of causality. And causality is different from correlation, and much of econometrics until then tried to get at causality, but really was more about correlation. And the difference between the two is that correlation means that two events kind of happen together, two things move together. Causation means that one thing occurs because of the other thing. And that's important because we can see things that are highly correlated that really don't have anything to do with one another. And this is a slide that I love to show, which is that you can see that divorce rates in the state of Maine are very, very highly correlated with per capita consumption of margarine. And so if you want to save marriages in Maine, buy butter, right? But that's completely ridiculous. No one could possibly believe that if people just ate more butter, families would be more intact in the state of Maine. That's correlation without causation. Let's look at maybe another example that may be a little closer to home, and that is if you're in California, should you go to the University of Southern California, or should you go across town to UCLA? Both are major universities in the city of Los Angeles. And how could we compare which school is worth going to? Which one is the better school to go to? Well, we could just look at the average pay of graduates, right? Just say, here is the typical pay of a UCLA graduate. Here is the typical pay of a Southern Cal graduate. And whoever has the higher pay, that's the school that contributes more to your earning power. But the students who go to the schools differ. USC students typically come from richer families. Some people say the University of Southern California, the initials USC stands for the University of Sports Cars, or maybe less charitably still, the University of Spoiled Children, it's been called. And the idea is that they can go to work for daddy's firm after college, that they've been born on third base, and it takes very little for them to go home. And this is a problem that we call selection bias, that there's something different about the people who choose to go to a private school like USC and who go to a public school like the University of California at Los Angeles. And so if we see that the graduates of University of Southern California earn more after graduation, is it because they learned more at USC, or is it because they were different, they were more privileged when they went in, and they are more privileged when they come out? So how do we separate out what they learned from their initial endowment? Well, one possible solution is what we call randomized controlled experiments. We could do this, we could conduct an experiment by selecting a sample of high school students and then randomly telling those students where they're going to go to college. So you go to UCLA, you go to UCLA, you go to USC, you go to USC. And by randomly choosing these people, we're conducting a controlled experiment that the people who go to one school are not inherently different from people who go to the other school. We can then compare their pay after graduation and actually get what the contribution of the school is. Obviously, this strategy has some problems. We can't tell people where they're going to college. We can't tell people you're going to college, you're not going to college if we want to study the impact of college in general. We can't tell young women how many children they're going to have if we want to study the impact of family size on women's labor supply or women's earnings. I can't go up to a woman and say, you're going to have one child. You're not going to have any. You're going to have 5. You're going to have 7. Can't do that. So this sort of strategy, this randomized controlled experiment, is good in theory, but hard to do in practice. What our laureates did was that they looked for what we call natural experiments, events, political events, natural, literally like nature events that exogenously, without having any element of choice by the participants, treated some people and not others. Some people are affected by a hurricane, other people are not. Some people are affected by a passage of a state law. People who don't live in that state are not. And so this resembles the laboratory conditions that we see in sciences like chemistry or physics. And that is really what Angrist, Card, and Imbens did. They made the social sciences more scientific. And they did so by looking at these natural experiments and in sometimes kind of simulating a natural experiment. We'll see some examples from their work now. So David Card did some very, very controversial work and fundamental econometric work on minimum wage laws. He did this with an economist named Alan Kruger, who I should mention, unfortunately, died. He took his own life a number of years ago, and he really kind of belongs in this pantheon with Card, with Angrist, and with Imbens. But David Card and Alan Kruger worked on this notion of the minimum wage, and they completely upset the apple cart, that everyone who's taken intro micro knows that raising the minimum wage increases unemployment. It can't possibly be otherwise. And it's just a simple matter of supply and demand. And you can't be around me very long without seeing supply and demand. So here we go. That, when we look at a minimum wage, we look at the labor market, and there's a demand for labor, slopes down because as labor becomes cheaper, as labor services become cheaper, employers are willing to hire more workers. So there's a negative relationship between the wage and the quantity of workers employed. The supply curve is upward sloping because as the wage increases, people are more willing to work, and people who are working are willing to work more. So we see a positive relationship between the quantity of labor supplied and the wage. So we have a downward sloping demand curve, an upward sloping supply curve, and where the two meet tells us the equilibrium wage and the equilibrium quantity of labor. If we apply a minimum wage, that's like a price floor. That's a minimum wage that you have to pay workers. You can't pay workers less than that dotted line, or horizontal line. But that crosses the demand curve at a much lower level of employment. And because we cannot force employers to hire people, we can't hold a gun to an employer's head and say, you must hire more workers, the lower level of employment results, and we see Q min apply as opposed to the equilibrium level of employment. And this is something that we teach everybody. Everybody who's taken intro micro knows this happens when we impose a minimum wage. However, Card and Kruger showed that the impossible was indeed possible, that a higher minimum wage, in particular, they looked at an increase in the state of New Jersey, did not increase or did not cause an increase in unemployment. Now, how did they do this? Well, it's surprisingly hard to do. How do you measure the impact of a minimum wage increase? Do we look at unemployment rates in Pennsylvania, let's say a neighboring state like Pennsylvania and New Jersey? That may not be enough. That may not be right. That may not give us the right answer because unemployment rates might always be higher in New Jersey than in Pennsylvania. There may be something about the workers in New Jersey or the structure of employment in New Jersey or other factors that make New Jersey different that cause unemployment to be higher in New Jersey. So we can't just compare New Jersey with, say, Pennsylvania and say that because unemployment is higher in New Jersey, that is a result of the minimum wage. Okay, so maybe we can look across time as opposed to across states. Maybe we can look at unemployment rates in New Jersey before and after the minimum wage was increased in New Jersey. Well, again, that may not give us the right answer because maybe there were some broad-based macro effects. Maybe the economy went into recession, the broader US economy or the regional economy in the Northeast went into recession, and that caused unemployment to rise everywhere. It went up in New Jersey, went up in Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware. It went up everywhere. So we can't really look across states, and we can't really look across time. Neither one is necessarily going to give us an accurate picture. So what do? Well, what Card and Kruger came up with is this notion of looking at the differences in differences, which has the unfortunately cutesy name diff and diff. And what they did effectively was to compare across time and across space. They looked at the unemployment rate in New Jersey after the minimum wage went up and before it went up. So they looked at the difference in minimum wages in New Jersey before and after. But remember, that's not wholly accurate. But then they looked at what happened in Pennsylvania before and after. And they computed the before and after difference in Pennsylvania. And then they took the difference in those two differences. They asked, how did the change before and after the higher minimum wage laws in New Jersey, how did that affect New Jersey compared to Pennsylvania? And by looking at the differences in differences, they're able to get a causal relationship between the rising minimum wage in New Jersey and whatever happened to unemployment. And what they found was, in fact, that the difference in New Jersey was really not different from the difference in Pennsylvania. The difference in differences was effectively zero. Now, what does this have to do with econometrics? Right, this is subtraction. This is something that a fourth grader could do. Well, the key here is that, of course, the difference in differences, any one of the differences, in fact, is not going, almost never going to be exactly zero. And so what we have to ask is this computation statistically significant? Is it meaningfully, in a statistical sense, different from zero? Because there's a lot of noise that goes on, and we have to ask, is the difference big or small relative to the statistical noise that's going on? So that's one reason why we have to go beyond simple subtraction. Another is that this is simply not conditioned on any factors. We may want to add observable differences between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. There may be factors that we can control for that we want to add to this, as opposed to just taking the raw difference. So we can move to a more sophisticated approach, and this is given by the basic econometric equation, where we have unemployment rates as the dependent variable on the left, and then a variable that indicates what state we're talking about. So state could indicate whether we're talking about Pennsylvania or New Jersey. The variable post simply tells us, are we talking about before or after the minimum wage increase was applied? And then that last variable in parentheses is simply the product of the two. A variable that indicates whether we're in New Jersey or Pennsylvania, or we're talking about New Jersey or Pennsylvania, and whether we're talking about before or after. And perhaps surprisingly, that coefficient beta sub 3, that coefficient of the product, tells us the difference in differences. All we have to do is look at beta 3, and that will tell us whether there was a causal effect of minimum wages. And again, we can add other control variables to this bare bones equation if we like. They found that beta 3 was statistically not different from 0. They could not reject, as we call it, the null hypothesis that beta 3 was 0, that there was no impact of the minimum wage. And this just created a firestorm. I went to a number of seminars with a very, very fine economist. I used to go to a labor seminar with David Newmark. Used to be at Penn, now I believe is out in California. And you would have thought his head was about to explode. I mean, he could not stop talking about this. He wrote papers about this. He said, this is wrong. This can't possibly be. There's all sorts of problems here. But even he eventually had to concede, yeah, this is, they're finding the right thing. I still think it's wrong, but I can't poke holes in what they've done. So that the impossible, that minimum wages do not increase unemployment, has been proven possible. And in fact, in follow-up research, by surprise, surprise, Orley Ashenfelter has found why this might be so. We could go into that a little bit later, but he's actually seen what has happened instead of rising unemployment. So Angrist and Imbens, I'm going to consider together because that's what the Nobel Committee did. Surprisingly, the prize was not divided 3 equal ways. David Card gets half, and Angrist and Imbens split the other half because the committee felt that their major contribution was made together, that they've worked a lot together. They've done written a number of papers together, and the committee cited their joint work. So it was kind of half of the prize was given to the 2 of them. Now, unfortunately, while David Card's work was at least relatively intuitive, much of what Angrist and Imbens has done is quite technical. I'm going to try to put some things together. It's not quite from one thing they did, but piecing a couple of different things together. And we're going to couch their contribution in a question that they addressed, which is, does military service affect earnings? And again, the solution looks simple, right? We want to know, do veterans earn more or less than non-veterans? Does military service help you by giving a sense of discipline, a sense of purpose, giving you skills? Does it help you in later life? Or does military service somehow hold you back? Does it create problems for you in later life? And again, we run into the same sorts of issues that Card and Kruger ran into when they were looking at minimum wages. And in particular, would veterans earn more or less, even if they had not served? Is there a self-selection problem here? Are people who are more disciplined more likely to go into the Army? Are people who are more ambitious likely to go into the Army? Or are people who have difficulties or problems that are going to harm them later in life, are they more likely to go into the military? How do we figure that out? And for good or ill, we cannot randomly assign people to the military. And so the question is, can we find, again, a natural experiment? And what Angrist and Imbens did was they looked back to the pre-Vietnam era and looked at the draft, the military draft, when young men age 17 or 18 were selected into the military. And so what they did was they replaced, the technical term is instrumented, I'll just use the word replaced, veteran status with draft number. So rather than looking at whether someone was a veteran, they went back several decades and asked, what was the impact of having a low draft number? Okay, if you had a high draft number, you could think of there being a series of balls in a jar, and for every day on the calendar, they pulled out a ball and it went 1 to 65. And if you are 1 to 365, and if on your birthday, they pulled out, when they got to your birth date, they pulled out 365, you were not likely to serve in the military. If they pulled out 3, then pack your bags, you're likely to be in the military. So can we, the broader question before we even ask, did it have an impact? Can we replace veteran status with draft number? More generally, they ask the question, what makes a good instrument? What makes a variable a good replacement for one we cannot really use? And they identified actually 4 factors, one of which I'm not going to talk about because it is strictly technical and I just don't want to get into it. But they identified 3 important factors for our purposes. And that is, 1, again, using this example, draft numbers were randomly assigned. They literally reached into a jar and pulled out a number. So smart people, disciplined people, motivated people did not get higher or lower draft numbers. The draft number was independent of your earnings potential. Second, draft status did not otherwise affect earnings, meaning your draft number impacted your earnings only through putting you in the military or not putting you in the military. That getting a 3 or a 360 did not cause you to do other things that affected your earnings potential. Finally, as seems obvious, and one could argue somewhat with the second point, but the third point is pretty clear. As I said, a low draft number made you more likely to serve. That people didn't join the Army in droves if they got a high draft number. And so when you meet these 3 criteria, you the replacement variable, when the replacement variable meets those 3 criteria, and again, one more that I'm not going to go into, that yields estimates that are on target. You don't have the problem, this self-selection problem that you have when you just include veteran status. And so this impact, the impact of this replacement variable, this instrument, they called the local average treatment effect, or LATE, L-A-T-E, L for local, A for average, T for treatment, E for effect. And so the draft number, the veteran status, is the treatment. The estimate that we get from putting in this replacement variable gives it its average impact. And so local meaning kind of in the, for a small region around the mean, average treatment effect. So that was, again, one of their major contributions to the econometric literature. What makes for a good replacement variable so that we can get at a causal relationship? Now, again, this is only a small sampling of their contributions that they've written on a wide variety of subjects. Just to give you a couple of examples, David Card has again challenged the kind of popular wisdom that immigrants drive down the pay of native workers. Again, simple supply and demand. Immigrants shift out the supply curve, drive down the pay of native workers, and he found that the impact was of second order importance, that it was really much smaller than common wisdom would have us believe. Josh Angrist has analyzed the optimal class size, interestingly using a formula that was first proposed by the medieval scholar Maimonides. And so if you're upset with how big your classes are, go to your dean and ask why he doesn't apply Maimonides' rule, because he actually applied centuries ago this notion that when a class size got to 40, you should split it. Guido Immons has done all sorts of work as well, researched, among other things, the impact of unearned income on labor supply. And in particular, he's looked very closely at the impact of what's been called the universal basic income, the idea of providing a minimum standard of living to all people so that we don't allow anyone to fall below a certain level. Some people have attacked this, saying it's a disincentive to work. And he has looked very carefully and econometrically at just this question. So again, I cannot think of three more deserving people for the Nobel Prize. Again, sometimes in the past I felt, well, you know, he's very good, she's very good, but they're just very good. These guys are great. These guys have really, as I said, just changed what applied econometrics is all about. And if that doesn't deserve a Nobel Prize, I have no idea what does. And with that, I guess we can throw the floor open to questions.
Thank you, Professor Leeds. That was really quite informative and entertaining, as I expected. And before Hazel starts reading off questions in the chat, so again, reminder, if you have a question for Professor Leeds, please put it in the chat and Hazel will read it out loud. I want to, however, also acknowledge gratefully the help of not only Hazel, the president of Theta of PA, but also Rachel Small, the vice president, and Bobby Miller, the secretary, who've been doing work behind the scenes, monitoring the chat and putting announcements in the chat that I then put out because I realized only I could reach all participants. Silly me, I didn't set it up exactly right. Okay, so Hazel, go right ahead, please.
Thank you. Yes, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and then I can read them out to Dr. Leeds. So we have one question from Peter Bartholomew. So why is your class over 40 students? Does that mean your TA has higher status?
Well, I don't think Reb Moses Ben Maimon, otherwise known as Maimonides, had any TAs, but he basically felt, and he was teaching effectively Bible, and he felt that students, when you got over 40, simply did not learn as much, did not learn as well. And so he had it as a rule that when his class got up to 40 students, he would then, when he got to 41, he would split it into a class of 20 and 21. So it really was based on his view of effective learning.
Great, thank you. Professor Doss has a question. How has the work of the laureates impacted the policy conversation? Have policymakers looked at their work or subsequent researchers' work using these methods to formulate policies?
Oh, dear, dear, dear. Would that they had more. A professor of mine, Alan Blinder, once said that economists don't know a whole lot, but policymakers know a whole lot less. Unfortunately, many of our policymakers are either doctrinally or for personal political reasons or ambitions, unwilling or unable to understand what they're being told by economists. So it is certainly greatly affected what is the state of knowledge in economics. It has not had as much impact on policy as I wish it did, and it probably should.
Thank you. Jalen Brown asks if you can elaborate on how increasing minimum wage could in turn not increase unemployment, as this is crucial to bridging the gap between predominantly minorities living in impoverished environments and white upper class Americans.
Okay, yeah, and let me, and we're going to talk about Orley Ashenfelter again, but let me go back to the picture that I showed before, and let me just, whoops, there we go. Let me just go back to here we go. Okay, where this picture clearly showed a drop in employment, right? That we went from the equilibrium level where the two meet to some lower level of employment. Now, clearly, that displacement depends upon the shape of the demand curve. I'm going to make a statement that is, all professors, please cover your ears. I'm going to say something that is clearly wrong, but is at least useful. I want you to think about the slope of the demand curve. As the demand curve becomes steeper, and that is at least related to the notion of elasticity, if those of you who have taken economics, as the demand curve becomes less elastic, again, I apologize, there's a lot of slippage there if we're being strictly correct. But as the demand curve becomes steeper, that displacement becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, until finally, if the demand curve is vertical, there's no displacement at all, that the unemployment does not rise at all. If it becomes flatter, displacement rises. And so the question is the demand curve flat or steep? Is it sensitive to changes in the wage or insensitive to changes in the wage? And what effectively Card and Kruger were saying is that the demand for low wage workers is relatively inelastic, that it doesn't, the quantity of labor demanded does not respond very much to increases in the wage. And so the trade-off that we always faced was some people benefit because their wage goes up, other people are harmed because they're displaced. What they found was the displacement effect is much smaller than people had initially figured. And what Orley Ashenfelter found, he looked at the impact of, he and actually Stepan Jurajda, a Czech economist, they looked at McDonald's and they asked what happened at McDonald's, and I forget exactly where they were looking, what state they were looking at, but what happened at a McDonald's when a minimum wage increase occurred. And what they found was that McDonald's simply charged more for its hamburgers. They passed through the higher wages to the customers. The customers continued to buy McDonald's hamburgers. The McDonald's continued to employ their workers at the higher wage. From this, my guess is that that labor is so cheap at these, and again, we're talking very, very low wages. Labor is so cheap that it really wasn't that much of a consideration for McDonald's. And so they just kind of passed along a higher pay. They didn't feel compelled to raise the wage. I'm sorry, to get rid of workers. And their customers, again, perhaps because McDonald's hamburgers are not that expensive, didn't feel put off by paying 10, 15, 20 cents more for a Big Mac. And so I think, again, we can explain it, but it was something that we didn't really look close enough at and until Card and Kruger came along and found this surprising finding.
Thank you. It is 12:50. It's very sadly because I wanted to hear much more Q&A. So it is time to display the code for Fox students to scan with their phones. So please do that. And the lecture has been recorded, and in due time, it will appear in the Theta of PA website. So thank you very much to Professor Leeds for the wonderful lecture. Thank you to Dean Chris Wolfgang for his presentation of Phi Beta Kappa. Thank you to Hazel Puchalski for doing all this work, running the event smoothly, or helping me to run, and the same for Rachel Small and Bobby Miller. And at this point, I bid you all a good afternoon, have a good weekend. And do please reach out to me. The email is in the chat with any questions about how to join Omicron Delta Epsilon. Bye, everybody.